I want to tell you just kind of a general observation, and then I want you to tell me the application. Whenever Peter and the apostles first preach and teach the message of the gospel on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, all the passages that are quoted in Acts chapter 2 during Peter and the apostles as they share the story of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and his ascension, in all those quotations, one is from the book of Joel chapter 2. The next one is from Psalm 16. The next one is from Psalm 132. And the next one is from Psalm 110. Whenever you think about how often the Psalms are quoted in the preaching of Jesus, what do you think we can learn as we study through the Psalms? More about Jesus. So often we don't always look through the Old Testament to really come to gain and understand about Jesus. And yet whenever the Spirit of God was working through these 12 apostles, it's amazing how that 3 out of the 4 passages of Scripture that gets quoted is specifically from the book of Psalms. And so as we look through the book of Psalms, may we always be on the lookout for Jesus. To see applications, sometimes even quotations that Jesus would use, and to kind of take those things to heart. If you would, look over at Psalm 31. Because Psalm 31 is so lengthy, we're going to divide it up into 2 weeks. Hopefully we'll be able to cover the first 13 verses tonight and then be able to come back next week and cover verses 14 through 24. Really tonight, in these first 13 verses, you learn more about the situation at hand as opposed to the response, which is more so next week. But we're going to hit on just the edge of it tonight because I can't leave you with that much of a cliffhanger. But I want you to kind of think in your mind for a minute. If you were in a brand new place and all of a sudden a tornado sirens started going off, what would you be looking for to a place to go? Shelter? Bathroom under the bed? Basement? You go, and why would you look for those type of places? Shelter, safety, a place of protection, right? We go, you know what, I want to look for a place that doesn't have any windows. I don't want any of the glass to be shattered. I want to go to a place that it's completely supported. I know of a family that they actually have a room in their house. It is concrete on every side. 4 walls, well, 3 walls, has a full metal door, concrete on top and concrete underneath. Specifically made for that purpose. And to go, in times of difficulty or question, they know exactly where they're headed because it's already laid out. Now, I wanted to start there because I want you to look at the first verse of Psalm 31 and make the application. David writes, "In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, deliver me." David says, Lord, you're my refuge. You're my stronghold. He's going to use language like, you're my fortress. And to think, whenever things get really difficult in our lives, do we know where safety is? It's interesting. We know it when we hear the tornado sirens where to go. But when life gets difficult, why does it take us so much time to go, you know what, I need to stand in the refuge of who God is and let Him be Lord. And so, as we've noted before through the book of Psalms, there's kind of 3 distinct layers in every psalm. There's the original layer, like with David. Okay, how does this apply to David's life? Then there's another layer where you look at it and go, what did it mean to Jesus in His life? And then you come to the third layer and go, what does that have to do with us? How does that respond? Now, when you think of the very first verse here, who did David think of as his refuge? God did. Who did Jesus think of as his refuge? God the Father. Who should we think of as our refuge? Jesus. Right? You go, every spiritual blessing is found in Jesus. Do we know that's the place to go? That's where to dwell. I think about times where you sit down and you study with couples. Marriage is difficult and hard, and they want to know, man, how do we get our relationship back together? Where do you think the right person to send them to is? Isn't it to Jesus? To go, this is where you find a refuge. He says, are you going to follow what Jesus says about marriage? He says, because then you'll find a refuge. Then you'll find a strength. And so he says, in you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. You almost think maybe in today's language, say, oh, don't let me down. But that's the wrong attitude, because that makes it sound like he's iffy. But the idea is, let me never be ashamed. He says, in your righteousness, deliver me. Notice whose righteousness David points to. He points to God's righteousness. Who does he not point to? Himself. Sometimes people respond and go, God, I'm worthy that you should save me. Well, that's a terrible idea. To go, will you take care of me because of your righteousness? Because of who you are? And you think, here's Jesus. If you can think about it just from your memory. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, it talks about, and God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. It's because of him that we've been made righteous. And so he takes these things together. Let me never be ashamed. Let me never be ashamed that I have chosen you as my refuge, because you are the power. And if you're kind of wondering, even just for a moment, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26, Paul even specifically tells the church at Corinth, because Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. So you go, there's the refuge. There's the fortress. Then look at verse 2. He says, incline your ear to me. Rescue me quickly. Be to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me. He says, incline your ear to me. You almost think of, lend me your ear. But I want you to look back at the book of Proverbs. Look at Proverbs chapter 15. I just want you to see these two proverbs. So often when we think about praying to God, people make really silly statements about, I hope he hears me. Well, how crazy is that? To think that an all-knowing God wouldn't hear. But I want you to see the relationship side of this. Proverbs chapter 15, look down at verse 8. He says, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. He says, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. And in Hebrew, the word abomination is the sound for somebody throwing up. In other words, the offerings, the sacrifice of the wicked makes me sick. It is deplorable, disgusting. What do you mean to tell me how much you love me? And you're wicked? But then he turns it around. He says, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. Now think about the things that bring you delight. And now realize that's the way God hears the prayer of the upright. That is his delight. As parents, whenever your children come and talk to you and they want to have a heart-to-heart, are you glad they came? Do you invite those kind of conversations? And you go, here's God. He says, the prayer of the upright, they're looking to do things God's way. He says, This is His delight. Then, look down a little bit further in the same chapter. Look at verse 29. He says, the Lord is far from the wicked, but He hears the prayer of the righteous. Notice, does God respond the same way to the wicked as He does to the righteous? Certainly not. You go, look, God hears everyone's prayers, but He's only responding to the upright and the righteous, with one exception. When the wicked call out, what's God going to give them an opportunity for? Salvation for their soul. That's the number one goal. God is not in the business of being the medical healer of everybody. Now, spiritually, that's what He cares about, because that's the eternal weight. Doesn't mean He doesn't care about us physically, but that's not the top priority. If you remember the man who had 4 friends, he was paralyzed and let him down through the roof. Remember what does Jesus address first? Son, your sins are forgiven you. Now, for those 4 friends who brought him, I'm not sure that was their number one concern. I'm sure they had to be thinking, they had enough faith to bring him to Jesus to go, at least we only got to carry him one way. But at the same time, Jesus addresses the spiritual first. Then, what does He address? Then the physical. Now, here He points out, He says, the Lord is far from the wicked, but He hears the prayer of the righteous. He says, that's where His ear is attentive. So come back over to Psalm 31. So in verse 2 he says, incline your ear to me, rescue me quickly, be to me a rock of strength. Now, you think, quickly, why does He want it to be so quick? Why do we typically want things quick? Usually because we're impatient, right? Here He says, incline your ear to me, rescue me quickly. He says, will you take care of me? He says, be to me a rock of strength, a rock of protection, a stronghold to save me. Verse 3, He says, for you are my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, you will lead me and guide me. He says, for you are my rock. You might even have a footnote for rock. What does it say? A crag, like a cleft in the rock, a cutout. And he says, for you are my rock and my fortress. David ever hide in a cave? He certainly did. And what was impending upon him? Saul. And Saul was looking to do what? Kill him. Can you understand why he might say, come to me quickly? I mean, Saul's right there in the same cave. You go, don't wait, please. And to think, here's God delighted to hear from David. And then to see, does God deliver him? He does. He does. He says, for your name's sake, you will lead me and guide me. When you hear for your name's sake, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Reputation? Anything else? Yeah, His purpose. Think in terms of what God is known for. That's what your name is, right? Your name is your reputation. Some people are known for being kind. Some people are known for being generous. Some people are known for having wisdom. Some people are known for being funny. Some people are known for all kinds of things. But to go, He says, for your name's sake will you lead me and guide me. Because that's who you are. Now, you think about, because that's who you are. He says, will you lead me and guide me? I want you to think for just a moment. How do you hear the words lead and guide? They have some similarities, but what's the difference? Yeah, lead is in front of. So that means if He lead me for your sake, that means I'm going to follow. What does guide carry with it as a difference from that? Yeah, the right way. To be beside, to teach, to instruct. He says, for your name's sake, because of who you are, will you lead me? Will you show me the right path? And will you guide me? Will you instruct me on the way to go? Because of who you are. Then he continues on here. He says in verse 4, he says, you will pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me, for you are my strength. He says, you'll pull me out of the net that they have secretly laid for me. Did David always know the trouble that was coming? No. I mean, the king calls you because he has worked against God, and God's Spirit leaves Saul. And so Saul calls on David because Saul's servants say, hey, there's a young man who plays the harp really well, very soothing, and he's a warrior. He says, why don't you call him and let him play for you? And so David responds just the way you would if the king called you. Little does he know, what is this? It's going to be a trap. And all of a sudden, here's the stupidity of sin. The only way Saul is finding relief, for temporary relief, is through music. Let's see, do people still use music that way? Yeah. Whenever people use music to set their mood, they're in trouble. And all of a sudden, here's David, who comes in, plays the harp, soothes Saul for a while, and what does Saul want to do? Throw his spear and pin him to the wall, even kill him. Now, isn't that stupid? The only one who's given you any relief, and you go, that's the one I want to kill. Isn't it amazing what sin does to people? Now, he says, you will pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me. How many times did David do that? Not just once. Several times. Even other times he's invited to feasts so that they can kill him. But here's Saul's son Jonathan to help him. And you realize, he says, you will pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me. We may not know it, but guess who does? God does. I hope you've had the benefit of learning at some point in your life after you came to Christ, somebody who had some mean intentions for you, and it never came together for them. And to see that God took care of you. I know I've seen it. Sometimes the words that people say, and all of a sudden later on they come and they actually tell you. And you go, I had no idea. And you realize, guess who took care of me? That was the Lord. He's my strength. He says, for you are my strength. Verse 5. He says, into your hand I commit my spirit. You have ransomed me, O God, God of truth. What do you hear in that? Trust. Just kind of on the surface, into your hand I commit my spirit. Why spirit? Okay, soul is the everlasting part. Okay, think about it. Spirit's about attitude, isn't it? So you think in those terms. Soul is the eternal part of it. Spirit is about, hey, what's my attitude in this? We also know from James what happens to the body when the spirit leaves. It dies. Just like faith without works is dead, the body without the spirit is dead. So the spirit's what gives animation to the body. But to go, here's spirit. Sometimes people might say, what spirit are you of? And you go, some people are high-spirited. Some people are kind of down in the dumps. But you look at here and he says, into your hand I commit my spirit. I'm going to let you control my attitude. I'm going to let you control the way I go about things and the way I think. He says, into your hand I commit my spirit. He says, you have ransomed me, O God, God of truth. And you might have a footnote there that says God of faithfulness. Think about that. He says, you have ransomed me, O Lord. Think about ransom. When do people normally pay a ransom? To get something back in return. Now, hold your place here. We're going to go over to the New Testament. Hopefully this has already clicked through. But look over at Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. (44 and 45). Jesus is being crucified. He says, it was now about the 6th hour, 12 o'clock noon, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Verse 45. Because the sun was obscured and the veil of the temple was torn in two. You go, all right, here we are. We're at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The veil of the temple is torn. I want you to notice the very first word of verse 46. And. So realize these things take place at the same time. He doesn't say then. That would show the next in a sequence. He says, and Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. The last words of Jesus. And if you look at the sequence of it, right before here, he said, it's finished. But you got to put it together with other gospel accounts. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Did they lay a trap for Jesus? Who did Jesus set his refuge as? His Father. And you realize, here he is and going through these things. Incline your ear to my cry. How many times did he talk to his Father while he's being crucified? My God, why have you forsaken me? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Who's he crying out to? Father. He says, incline your ear. And you realize there's still a relationship there in some way. Now, notice the next verse, verse 47. He says, now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. Is that a righteous man? He was made to be sin for us. But what did he bring to the cross? His own righteous life. That's what he came to offer up as God's lamb, right? Because the lamb that's brought to the sacrifice has to be perfect, spotless, without blemish. And you go, here's the righteousness of God. And here we are, made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. What does that tell us about how much we've been cleansed by the blood of Christ? To be the righteousness of God? Yeah, but only in him. As our refuge, as our fortress, as our strength. Now come back over to Psalm 31. So you see the different layers here of David. He says, I commit my spirit to God. Jesus, I commit my spirit to my Father. Us, we commit our spirit to the Lord, Jesus, to God. He says, you have ransomed me. Didn't Jesus ransom us? Doesn't it kind of seem like David was being quoted? Whenever Jesus cries out, do you think he wanted them to read Psalm 31? Do you see how many connections there are here? Maybe somebody would catch it and go back and do some looking and reading. Now, as Psalm 31 continues, verse 6, he says, I hate those who regard vain idols, but I trust in the Lord. Who are those that regarded vain idols that David had been around? David ever fight any Philistines? They have any gods? Like Baal? What about Saul? After God leaves him, who does he go to seek counsel? Remember when he goes to the witch of Endor to conjure up Samuel? from the dead? Even Saul. He's like, I hate him. But if you notice, David treats Saul in a special way because he's God's anointed king. He recognizes that, sees that as different. Verse 7, he says, I will rejoice and be glad in your loving kindness, because you have seen my affliction, you have known the troubles of my soul. He says, I rejoice because of your loving kindness, because of your mercy. Loving kindness is about covenant love, a covenant responsibility. He says, I rejoice and I'm glad because of your loving kindness, because I know you always keep your covenant. You will take care of me. He says, because you have seen my affliction. And I want you to think about, he talks about you've seen my affliction. He doesn't say you've heard about my affliction. What's the difference? Witness. It tells you who's walking with David as he is obedient to God. God is with him. Isn't that the way Jesus talks about it? He says, I'm not alone. He says, my Father is with me. Isn't that the way we should respond? I'm not alone. I walk with the Lord. And therefore, He walks with us. He continues here. He says, you have known the troubles of my soul. Think about how deeply He knows us. Have you ever seen your soul? Has God? Has the Lord? He knows you better than you know you. David recognizes that. You have known the troubles of my soul. In your deepest troubled times, who knows what you need? And who is attentive to the prayer of the upright and the righteous? Then why don't we ask? It's His delight to hear the upright prayer, the prayer of the upright. Then he says, you have known the troubles of my soul. He says, verse 8, and you have not given me over into the hand of the enemy. You have set my feet in a large place. He says, you don't just hand me over to Saul. You didn't just hand me over to Goliath. You didn't just hand me over to the Philistines. You didn't just hand me over to Absalom. You go, you're my fortress. You're the reason I'm still here. And then he says, you have set my feet in a large place. That may sound kind of odd to you. Like, what's this all about? Well, if you want to know a little bit more, you can make a little note. Psalm 118, verse 5, uses the exact same Hebrew word. And it's about going to a place that is free from distress. You might use the term, you've made me carefree. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to be concerned. Because I know I'm walking with you and you're with me. You know the afflictions of my soul, the deepest, farthest parts down, that I don't talk to anybody about. You know them. And you are attentive to the prayer of the upright and the righteous, and it is your delight to hear. In the same way that we are delighted to hear from our children, He is delighted to hear from His. Now, he comes to this aspect, and verse 8 is the, you've not handed me over? Okay, that's later. But what about now? What about right now? He says, you have set my feet in a large place, a place where there's no distress. And then he comes to verse 9. He says, be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. Do you see what's going on here? He says, I know what you're going to do. I know you're going to take me there. But what's David saying right now? I'm still under distress. I am waiting upon you. I am crying out to you, my refuge, my rock, my fortress. I know you'll set me in a place where there's no distress. But I haven't been set there yet. And so when he says, be gracious to me, will you show me your grace? And this is not one of those senses that we typically think of grace like, okay, just forgive me. And he's going to get to something like that here in a moment. But to go, will you give me beyond what I deserve? He says, for I am in distress. He says, my eye is wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. How far down can grief affect us? Down to your very soul. Look at the way he talks about it. He says, be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. Have you ever seen someone who is in the grips of grief? And you can tell it's affecting them physically? Have you seen that? I think you probably have. And you look at this, and here's David saying, I'm wasting away. My eye is wasted. What does that make you think he's been doing? Crying. Sometimes grief takes you to these places. And you go, we grieve so often over someone who's passed because we shared that time together so much. It was so precious to us. And then when they're gone, we realize, I'm not going to share any more moments like that are new. Thank the Lord we have our memories to remember the ones that we do cherish. But sometimes grief can take us way down the road to a very difficult place. That's why David talks about, you know the griefs of my soul. You know the troubles that go so far down beyond just the surface. And yet, aren't we thankful to serve a God who can work within us beyond what's just on the surface? Now, he makes the statement here. I want you to notice the next thing, verse 10. He says, for my life is spent with sorrow, and my years with sighing. My strength has failed because of my iniquity. Oh, iniquity, what's that the word for? Guilt. That's the Old Testament word for guilt. What has brought all this on? His guilt. Now, let's take a look and see where this would fit in David's life. Look back at 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 13. Hopefully we'll have enough time here. 2 Samuel chapter 13. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is David's sin with Bathsheba. But he's not talking about that one over in Psalm 31. Then comes 2 Samuel chapter 12 where Nathan confronts David with his sin. And David makes his heart response and his move. He says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Oh, there's that spirit word again. Then you come here to chapter 13. Absalom, one of his sons, born through Bathsheba, also has what we would refer to as a half-brother in Amnon, who loves Absalom's sister Tamar, who apparently is just as beautiful as her mom and dad. So Amnon has just been smitten in love with her. He loves her so much it makes him sick. And maybe you've known a love like that. And you go, it just tears you up because things aren't working out. And he can't find any way that he should ever be able to have this relationship with his half-sister, which I know to us sounds really yucky, and it is yucky. But I want you to kind of listen to some of these verses. There's a cousin of Absalom who gives Amnon some terrible advice. He says, well, just pretend like you're sick, and then whenever Dad comes and talks to you, being David, he said, just tell him that you want Tamar to come and serve you food. Have her make you some raisin cakes and just enjoy the company. Well, terrible advice. Look down at verse 7, 2 Samuel 13:7. Then David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, half-brother, stepbrother, and he was lying down. And she took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. She took the pan, dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, Have everyone go out from me. So everyone went out from him. This is already sounding terrible, isn't it? Well, it's going to get worse. Verse 10. Then Amnon said to Tamar, Bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand. Just red flares going off, isn't it? So Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, Come lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where can I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you'll be like one of the fools in Israel. Certainly would be. I mean, a big-time fool. He says, Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. Look at how she approaches this. She says, Just ask David. He says, if he approves, fantastic. What does she know? She knows her dad enough to know there's no way he's going to allow this. But here's what desires do whenever you let them take over control. Verse 14, However, he would not listen to her since he was stronger than she. He violated her and laid with her. He rapes her. Disgusting. Evil. Wicked. Then, notice what happens in Amnon's heart. What he always wanted. And now, verse 15. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred. For the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, Get up, go away. All of a sudden, everything changes. That's what sin does. It draws you in, and once you get it, you realize how stupid you are. But it changed. He didn't even recognize how stupid he was yet. He just sends her away. Now, this brings us to David. Absalom finds out about this. And Absalom and Tamar are close brothers and sisters. And to find out that his own half-brother raped his sister, he goes and tells David, wanting him to do something about it. And if you look down in verse 21, David actually is very angry about it, but he doesn't do a thing about it. He never responds. Absalom then, he goes off and he breaks up a plot and he kills Amnon. And rightfully so, he kills Amnon. Then, Absalom's on the run. Let's see it, make sure I get you the numbers right. For 3 years, he lives at Geshur. And his dad never once calls to him. Finally, he sets somebody's field on fire, and David calls him to live in Jerusalem. Absalom's there for 2 more years, but never sees his father David. It's been 5 years since David has even spoken to Absalom, because Absalom did what was right in killing Amnon for the wickedness and the evil that he had done to his own sister. All of a sudden, Absalom rises up. He puts together a little bit of a coup. He starts a little group to be king. And now Absalom becomes his enemy. Absalom and David are completely at odds. They go out to war. David even tells them, protect young Absalom. But one of the commanders doesn't listen on purpose. And all of a sudden, here's Absalom, because of his long hair. I mean, it's like 5 pounds worth of hair every year. It would grow. And he gets caught up in the tree, and he goes over and he kills Absalom. And whenever Absalom is dead, they come back and they give word to David. And how does David respond? Absalom, oh Absalom, I wish they'd have killed me instead of you. And here is the guilt. I should have responded better when Tamar was raped. It would have been right for the king to kill his son Amnon. But because I didn't respond, Absalom killed him. And because I wouldn't respond to Absalom, then these other things take place. And you can understand why. Come on back here to Psalm 31. Whenever David speaks, he says, my eye is wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. David's own commanders have to come to him and basically shake him and say, you are being foolish. These men have all risked their life for you, and you are mourning over the enemy. What is wrong with you? He says, I'm wasting away. It kind of tells you what was going on inside of David. He says, my life is spent with sorrow and my years with sighing. My strength has failed because of my iniquity and my body is wasted away. I should have taken refuge in God. I'll give you the note. It's over in Leviticus chapter 20. Well, let me make sure I give you the right one. Let's see, I wrote this down. If you go over and look at it, when he brings up about what happens, over in Leviticus, there's a specific verse that deals with this and says if a brother lies with his sister in the same relationship, may not have both parents be the same, but just one of them. He says he is to be cut off from Israel. He's to be killed. Realize, here's David. If I'd have just followed the law, I would have got it right. But I held back. And so, what you see as part of it, as it goes through, you start to see what's welling up inside of him because of his iniquity. And then, of course, he goes on here, verse 11. He says, because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. He says, they see me and they go the other way. If you've ever had that kind of shame, where what you've done is known and people see you and you see their eyes and then you see them go the other way. David says, I know that feeling. And realize, and I know why. It was because of my own wicked choices. Because of my own guilt. He says, verse 12, I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. I am like a broken vessel. What do you do when you drop a plate at home and it breaks to pieces? What do you do with it? Throw it away. How many do you remember? Not very many, unless it was very special to you to start, right? He says, I'm like a broken vessel. He says, for I have heard the slander of many. Terror is on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they schemed to take away my life. Does that sound like Jesus? Not the sin. They took counsel together against me, they schemed to take away my life. Isn't that exactly what they did with Jesus? And then, here's the sneak peek for next week, verse 14. But as for me, what's the right response to the situation? But as for me, I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. And as soon as David makes that turn, what do you think's going to happen? Isn't that what Jesus did while he was being crucified? You are my God. He even quotes it from the book of Psalms. My God, my God. And he knows why he's been forsaken. You also realize, one more quick thought with Jesus. Look over at the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, look down at verse 41. Luke 19:41. When Jesus approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it. What makes Jesus cry? Verse 42. Saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation, time of being visited by God in the flesh. And you see Jesus, even he weeps over Jerusalem. How many opportunities had Jerusalem been given and would not make Jehovah their God? And it cost them. Lord willing, next week we'll come back and we'll finish out Psalm 31. And you really get to see the exciting part of this chapter. Here I tell you all the doldrums, and then you're just left. Sorry. But we'll get to the second half next week.
Closer, closer, draw me to thy dear self, my hope, my joy, my all. Hold thou my hand, lest haply I should wander, and missing thee, my trembling feet should fall. Hold thou my hand, that when I reach the margin of that lone river, thou didst cross for me. A heavenly light may flash along its waters, and every wave like crystal bright shall be. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine! Heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, perfect delight, visions of rapture now burst on my sight. Angels descending bring from above, echoes of mercy, whispers of love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I in my Savior am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking above, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave. Weep for the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus is merciful, Jesus will save. Jesus is merciful.